Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderón Muñiz.
All right, guys. I don't know if you've been counting, but today is the 50th episode. And so I am super excited. We've made it. This is our 50th episode of the Jack Westin MCAT Podcast. And so we decided to do something special. It's also obviously right in the heaviest time of the MCAT season right now. And so we wanted to bring our 10 favorite MCAT mnemonics. There's a couple here that I didn't learn until after I'd taken the MCAT, a couple that I wished I would have known. And so hopefully you guys won't fall into that problem that I had. And so you guys will have these tools for your MCAT as it approaches. But I am super excited because there's some mnemonics in here that I'm just like, ooh, this is my favorite. And it's so funny and I love it. And so hopefully you guys find this episode to be like fun as well as useful. That's the thing we're always striving for. This is like, let's make it entertaining, but also help you on the day of your actual test.
I'm honestly so excited. Like 50 episodes has just kind of passed so quickly. And at the same time, like it's just covered so much. So very just like beyond excited to have made it to this fantastic benchmark. So I think there are some classics in here. And if you haven't already heard this one will become a classic for you. So we're going to start off with probably one of my favorites, and that's red cat and ox. And so that's telling you in electrochemistry that reduction is occurring at the cathode and that oxidation is occurring at the anode. And I don't know about you, but electrochemistry always messed me up. Like I was just like, I don't know where the electrons are going. I don't know what's happening. How am I supposed to keep track of this? When they give you, like one, they'll give you one element on one side and then the other element on the other side, and you have to figure out in which direction the electrons are moving. And I think this idea of cathode, anode, and where the reduction and oxidations are happening was something I personally struggled with a lot. And so this was a mnemonic that I'm actually pretty sure I used on test day. Like I have at this point in my med school, a pre-med career, there are like a couple of questions that I still remember. And I'm fairly sure I had one on electrochem and used this mnemonic.
Yeah, this mnemonic is actually like one of my favorites. Also because you can't mess it up if you speak English, because an ox makes sense. But an red or an cat doesn't make grammatic sense. So there's no way to mess this up, which is exactly the sort of mnemonic that I need. I do also just want to like remind people that this mnemonic doesn't matter what kind of like electrochemical cell you're dealing with, galvanic, voltaic, concentration cells, electrolytic cells. The reduction is always at the cathode and oxidation is always at the anode. Speaking of which, I feel like everyone has mnemonics for oxidation and reduction kind of beyond this. And so this takes us to our second mnemonic here, which is, for me, I like the Leo says grr one. And so some people use oil rig, which oil rig is oxidation is lost, reduction is gained. I never really liked that mnemonic because I feel like I sometimes got confused. I'm like, okay, is it gaining charge or is it gaining electrons? Because if you gained an electron, you would become more negatively charged. And so like that, like saying reduction is gained, like what's gained, electrons or charge? I'm like, that always confused me. So that's why I like the Leo says GER one. So Leo says GER, that's LEOGER, right? Leo says GER. So losing electrons, oxidation, gain electrons, reduction. This is like a really high yield one for just chemistry overall, because they'll like straight up ask you like which thing was oxidized here in this reaction. But you can also combine this with the last mnemonic with the red cat and an ox. And so if losing electrons is oxidation, but you like oxidation is also the anode because an ox, then that means you're losing electrons at the anode. And that's always true. And so I think electrochemistry, as you mentioned, for my money, I think electrochemistry is the most complex chemistry topic. And so like those two mnemonics go really far in like helping you kind of master electrochemistry, as well as the Leo says GR is useful kind of outside that into like organic chemistry and general chemistry. And so I know it's like a classic and a lot of people use oil rig, and if that works for you, use it. But I much prefer the Leo says GR. I think also because I am a Leo. And so I'm just, it's about me. So I love it.
I think I really like this one because it's kind of adorable. So you use like Leo goes grr. For me, in my head, I'm always picturing Leo the lion goes grr. And so it just like you have this image, and I have this image of this adorable lion, and they're just like, instead of, roaring, they're just going grr. And it just, it sticks. You can't forget it. I learned this one in in undergrad, and it has stuck with me all this time later. So I personally am a very big fan of this one as well. I think it's also there. I think these are very useful for topics that are hard, but also topics that you just have to memorize and that may not make sense otherwise, right? And so I think that there's one that is used for figuring out what hormones are being released from the pituitary, right? And so it has the anterior and posterior. So this mnemonic, I also learned pretty early on in studying for the MCAT, and it has also stuck, and that's flat peg. And so to remember which ones are which, you just think flat first, and these are the trophic hormones. So they're going to impact the production of other hormones, right? And so that's FSH, right? Follicle stimulating hormone. LH, which is luteinizing hormone. So we have the FL from flat peg. A is a adrenocorticotropic hormone. And so that's ACTH is the other name for it. And then the T is TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. And what's really cool is the name tells you what it does, right? For all of these. And so that's something that can be really helpful, right? So we're halfway through, other half, PEG. And so that's prolactin. Again, the name tells you what it does. Endorphins, and then growth hormone, or you'll also see it written as GH. And again, they tell you what they do, which is really cool. And so I like to chunk and figure out, okay, kind of what does each one do, so I remember what's going on. So LH and FSH involved both in the menstrual cycle and the production of testosterone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone, that's involved at the adrenals, right? Adrenal glands and the production of cortisol. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, right? So I think that one's fairly self-explanatory. Prolactin, prolactation, right? So really important in breastfeeding. Endorphins, these are our natural painkillers that bind to opioid receptors. And so these are the kinds that give you like a runner's high, right? And so you're going to have it's just really awesome when they get released, right? Natural pain relief. And then growth hormone is going to be involved, right, in all things growing as you move across in the timeline of your life.
Yeah. I feel like red cat and an ox and Leo says GR, like those first two ones are ones that I ran into in undergrad as I was like studying electrochemistry or oxidation stuff. Flat peg is a classic MCAT like specific mnemonic. At least for me, I never ran into this until I was studying for the MCAT. And it really helped me kind of like keep straight the anterior pituitary, which is a mess because there's so much stuff going on in the anterior pituitary. And so there's that like tropic versus like the direct hormones. Those like, just to like reiterate, like the direct hormones, they go out and do stuff directly. Growth hormones makes your muscles and your bones grow. Like prolactin makes you start to like develop like milk and like produce milk kind of overall. Endorphins directly inhibit pain and make you feel good overall. But the tropic hormones, they don't do anything themselves. They go to other glands and tell them to do something. So FSH and LH go to the gonads. As you said, the adrenal ACTH, the adrenocorticotropic hormone, goes to the adrenal gland, and TSH goes to the thyroid gland. And so you want to make sure that you've got that separate. And that's another reason why I love that mnemonic, is just because flat is all tropic, PEG is all direct, makes it a lot easier. Another one that I like is one that is focused on food, because food is always the best. And this is also, I think, really high yield, because the MCAT loves to ask you about like the fundamental biological molecules, like amino acids are insanely high yields, but also nucleotides. And so you need to make sure you know which nucleotides are purines and which ones are pyrimidines. I know it's pronounced pyrimidines, but I always pronounce them pyrimidines because I think it's easier for students to hear and it's easier for this mnemonic. So I always remember that it's cut the pie. And so CUT, that's cytosine, uracil, and thymine, are pyrimidines. So cut the pie. I also really like this because it helps me remember that the pyrimidines, or pyrimidines, if you speak like a normal human, have one ring, right? Because a pi is just one ring. And so cut the pie, CU and T all have a single ring, and they're the pyrimidines. Now that means that the other ones have to be purines. So that would be adenine and guanine. And so those have two rings. The MCAT will expect you to be able to like look at a nucleotide and tell, is this like a C or a G, right? Is that a pyrimidine or a purine? And they will expect you to know that. And so you want to make sure that you can identify and recognize these. And so you want to make sure you have these down. There's a mnemonic for like the purines that a lot of people use, which is pure as gold. So the purines are adenine and guanine. But if you know that CU and T are the pyrimidines, then you don't need to have a mnemonic for the purines, just because everything else has got to be purines. And so cut the pie is one of my favorite mnemonics, just overall to kind of help you keep straight what's going on with the specific nucleotides.
Yeah, I think when I was studying, I would go back and forth in terms of which one I used, because pure as gold, I just found it nice to say, but I love food. And so cut the pie was also really just like helpful. So like you said, I think using one is completely okay. If you go back and forth like I did, nothing wrong with that either. But yeah, and you mentioned amino acids. And so amino acids are so high yield. You need to know them for test day. If you do not have their structures, abbreviations memorized, go do that now, then come back to this. No, but actually you do need to know it for your exam. So now it's time for the stop, wait a minute, codons. So the stop codons, there are two versions of these that I've heard use. And the second one I heard after I heard the first, so I use the first more often. So that's UGA, you go away, UAA, you are away, and then UAG, you are gone. So those kind of seemed a little negative, like you go away, like, you are away, you are gone. And so I heard this other one afterwards that was just so wholesome. And so I loved it. And it's you get A's, you are awesome, and you are great. And so that was another one that stuck with me, that I just think is just so nice. Every so often you need a pick-me-up. And so you can remind your friends while you're all studying for the MCAT together, if you have someone else that's studying with the MCAT, for the MCAT with you, that they are great.
Yeah, that's one of those things that like the MCAT does all the time. Like they'll throw a bunch of nucleotides at you and like a messenger RNA or something like that and ask you like, how many amino acids are made here? And so you have to recognize like, oh, there's a stop codon partway through this. And like, that's something you need to be able to look at a sequence. And so you have to know those three really well. I think that those are the only three codons that you actually need to have memorized. I don't think you need to have memorized like what are the codon options that create cysteine or histidine or alanine. You should maybe know the start codon, which is AUG. I always remember you start in August, and so AUG is the start codon. And I started in August, as you know, because I'm a Leo, because I mentioned that earlier. But like starting in August, and then like the end ones are UGA, UAA, and UAG.
Yeah, something else, another way that they can test you on this is give you a sequence and then ask you to figure out what mutation there is, right? Sometimes they give you like these charts, but you should be able to recognize if there's a stop codon. So if they do something like that, right, where they give you this like this sequence, finding those start codons is so important because they're just something that you need to recognize and produce a different type of mutation, right?
Yeah. I didn't have any of those mnemonics when I first tried to memorize these. And so I just did it phonetically, which is weird, but I just remembered ooga, ooah, ooag, like in my mind, just like that is like a weird chant. And so UGA, UAA, UAG. So however you want to remember it, make sure you do remember it. And have those down. I think you go away, you are gone, you are away. That's like, I think the most common way to do it. But I like your much more positive one and my more caveman one as well to kind of help identify those. So another mnemonic, and this is actually one that I didn't learn until after I took the MCAT, actually a couple of years after I took the MCAT. And this is one that I totally wish I would have known earlier, because this is a super useful way to help students remember the 6 basic universal emotions. This is actually our first mnemonic relating to psych, right? Now, psych's pretty high yield, and there's a lot of stuff to memorize for psych, and so there's a lot of great mnemonics. But I always kind of struggled. So there's these 6 emotions that are universal. It doesn't matter if you grew up on an island in the Pacific, or you grew up in the Amazonian rainforest, or you grew up in Texas or Alaska or Spain or whatever. Everyone experiences these same 6 emotions and expresses them facially the same way. And so this is a mnemonic. I don't even know if it's a mnemonic is the right term for it, but this is using the keyboard. So if you look down at the keyboard, right, where your left hand rests, right, it's ASDFGH, all in a row. And so that is actually the first letter for the 6 basic emotions: anger, surprise, disgust, gloom, or disgust, fear. There's an F in there, gloom, and then happiness. So technically it's supposed to be sadness instead of gloom, but that would make 2 S's, and that doesn't work, and that doesn't match things. So just remember, gloom is the same thing as sadness, being gloomy. So anger, surprise, disgust, fear, gloomy, and happiness. And gloomy is the same thing as sad. And so that's something that is also really useful for students, because this is one of the, you have a keyboard on test day, on the day of your test. If somebody asks and you're what are the emotions? You can just look down at your keyboard and be ASDFGH, right? Those are the ones. And so I think that is a really useful way to use something that the MCAT writers are giving you, they're giving you this tool to use. And so use the keyboard, ASDFGH. Like I said, that's one that I didn't know until much later. And I love when you can do something like that and you just kind of use the keyboard in front of you to remember something.
Random thought, right? But are you guys able to on demand make a face for each of the different emotions? Because I've been thinking about this, and I personally find it hard to make some of these faces on demand. I don't know about you, Phil.
Yeah. Well, I definitely won't, because some people might be watching this on video and I'm afraid they'll screen clip my disgust face and put it on different things. But yeah, that's definitely something. These emotions are also ones, the idea here is that we can recognize these emotions between each other. And so even if I don't speak Spanish and I meet someone in Spain, I can tell that they're sad, or I can tell that they're angry or surprised. That being said, there are problems where people do sometimes have issues recognizing these. There's some famous experiments. Generally, teenagers are awful at recognizing emotions in other people. They're the worst at it, and adults are way better, which kind of makes sense to me, because speaking for myself, when I was a teenager, I had a hard time recognizing my own emotions, let alone other people, right? And so that just kind of makes sense to me. Of course, teenagers are bad at recognizing emotions in other people. They're struggling with their own emotions and trying to deal with that, or at least speaking from my own experience.
That's very fair. Yeah, I think that it's helpful to think about each of the different, or find mnemonics for each of the different topics on the MCAT and the different sections. And so it can also be really helpful if you can to find mnemonics based on, like in biology, organ systems, because you have the different organ systems and you're going to be tested on them on test day, right? And so one that I wish I would have known when I was studying for the MCAT, but also low key when I started med school and had to take our neurology course, was same Dave. So same Dave, for same, it's sensory is afferent and motor is efferent, right? So if you think about the neuron sensory, you're getting the information, therefore it's afferent, right? So if I tap myself, the information is being sent to my brain for processing. Motor efferent, my brain is telling me to move my hands in all sorts of ways when I talk. And so for Dave, its dorsal is afferent and ventral is efferent. And so it's telling you, right, like back, right, towards back dorsal, that's afferent, that's where those signals are coming in. And ventral, right, is going to tell me that it's efferent and that's where the signal's coming out. And this is at the level of the central nervous system, right?
Yeah, specifically like the
spinal cord. Yep,
right.
Exactly. And so that's something, like I said, that I wish I would have known when I was in that course in med school and studying for the exam. So there are some of these that you'll just get to use in med school as well, similar to flat peg. And so tuck these in your back pocket because they'll continue to be useful for the next few years.
Yeah, that one, like for the spinal cord is one. I know a lot of people are like that. I feel like that mnemonic doesn't clarify things for me because like it's using weird language like dorsal and ventral and things like that, afferent and efferent. And like that doesn't just immediately like conjure an image into your brain. The thing is, those are terms that the MCAT will specifically expect you to know, and they will test you on them. So you got to make sure you know what those things mean. And this is a great mnemonic for just kind of putting this together. So like just once again, same Dave, SAME, DAVE. So sensory is afferent, motor is efferent. Dorsal is afferent and ventral is efferent. Also, if you struggle with dorsal and ventral, like you think about like a dorsal fin on like a shark, that's just like the shark, the fin sticking straight up because it's a dorsal fin. It's like on the back. This is really useful also in medicine because sometimes people will damage they won't cut the entire spinal cord, but they might damage one portion of it, either through a tumor or an accident or something like that. And depending on which part of the spinal cord is damaged, it's going to have different effects. So if I was in like a wreck and like a piece of shrapnel like cut through just the back half of my spinal cord, but didn't cut completely through it, I would lose the ventral. Or not the ventral. I would have the ventral, but I wouldn't have the dorsal side. I have trouble getting that signal down there. And because dorsal is afferent and sensory is afferent, that means in that case, like where I've cut just the back half of my spinal cord, I won't be able to feel my legs. I will still be able to move them, perhaps, because the ventral side is working. So I could kick and do stuff, but I can't feel anything in my legs. And so, this could obviously happen in the other direction as well. You could damage the ventral side and then the motor is messed up. You can't move your legs, but you can still feel your legs if the dorsal side is protected. And so this is something that you'll see all the time in neuro and medicine that you get tested on a lot, but also this is something that the MCAT will straight up expect you to know.
And with something like dorsal and ventral, when the MCAT has, they have like specific terms that are related to, different parts of the body that you are expected to know. When you're describing things, for example, on the physical exam when you're, in medical school, but also when you're a physician and writing these notes, these are the kinds of terms that you use. And so having a good understanding of them and really drilling them in when you're studying for the MCAT will make your life easier as you keep going along. So just a reminder, there are things on the MCAT that you will actively use frequently as a future physician.
Yeah. So we've talked about red cat and an ox. That's mnemonic number 1. Leo says gur. Flat peg is 3. Cut the pie is 4. You go away, you are gone is 5. The keyboard stuff, ASDFGH for the emotions is 6. Same Dave is 7. And I really wish that we would have done this in a different order because the next mnemonic is number 8. But the mnemonic is 7 up. Oh my gosh, totally should have been the 7th one.
We missed that one.
This one is one of my favorite mnemonics. This is also one that I learned specifically for the MCAT. Now, to be honest, I think that I was staying up really late and like studying, and I was kind of like tired because I remember learning this mnemonic and just cackling. Like I thought this was the funniest thing that I'd heard. And so this mnemonic 7-up is for the path of sperm in the male reproductive system. And so the 7-up, so SEVENUP, like this is explaining the path. So it starts off in the seminiferous tubules, the epididymis, the vas deferens, the ejaculatory duct, the urethra, and then the penis. And so if you're following through that, that's SEVEUP. And so some of you guys might be like, wait, that's sieve up. Well, like what about the N? Well, what does the N stand for? N stands for nothing. Like there's nothing there. And so that's what made me cackle, is like, oh, the N stands for nothing. It's just sieve up didn't make a good mnemonic. And so it's 7-up, but the N doesn't mean anything. It means nothing. And so N for nothing. I don't know why. I was really tired, and I was just like, that was the funniest mnemonic to me. And so this can be really useful for you to keep track of this pathway. There is a little bit of like a tricky thing in there with there's 2 E's, right? There's the epididymis and then the ejaculatory duct. And so don't get those 2 mixed up. Epididymis is first, and then the ejaculatory duct is later. Now that should make sense. Like the ejaculation is like, at the tail end of this, kind of getting that out there. So like the epididymis is going to come first, and that's where, there's like some maturation of the sperm and things like that. So 7-up is a great mnemonic to help you remember the path of sperm in the male reproductive system.
See, unlike this mnemonic, the next one has an N that does mean something. But no, when I was learning that one as well, I was just kind of like, for me, I think I was laughing more because like it made me think of soda. Yeah. Like the 7-up. So I was just like, ooh, more food mnemonics. I don't mind.
Yeah.
But yeah, so then the next mnemonic I think is also just fun because it reminds me of winter. And so I'm a winter baby. So all things winter, for the most part, I tend to enjoy. So this one is snowdrop. And so this is thinking about the basically like DNA versus RNA and the type of gels that you run for each of these. And so snowdrop, I like when I actually write it out, I write snow on top of drop. And that way I see exactly what corresponds to what. So the S in snowdrop corresponds to DNA. So a southern blot is going to basically use DNA, and that's what it's going to move, right? And so I think that hopefully is clear. It's just kind of something you just memorize on for test day. And then if you're working in a research lab, that's something that is going to be something that's important for you anyway. So I would memorize this one. Then the N in this one stands for a northern blot. And so a northern blot is going to have RNA, right? And it's going to show the difference in length of RNA, right? Because thinking about these gels, you're moving based off of either the DNA, RNA proteins are moving based off of size, length, right? Charge, all of those fantastic things. Now, unfortunately, even though the N in this one stands for something, we have O's that don't stand for anything. So I don't know how much better it actually is, but at least the N, I'm here for the N standing for something. And then that's SNO, right? DRO, we're missing the W and the P. So this is probably the one I think that students are most familiar with, and that's the Western blot, right? And the Western blot is moving proteins, right? Or proteins are moving on this gel. And so this is the one that you probably used in your, chemistry classes. You might have used a Southern blot if you were in biochemistry and you guys had that lab. I don't know about you guys, but I had a lab that we were like using DNA, and we were trying to see, how far it moved to try and figure out what genes we were looking at. They gave us kind of the genes already set. But that one is snowdrop.
Yeah. And it's kind of hard on like the podcast format, but like, just like you said, I always write this out with like snow, and then right underneath I write drop. And so the S is above the D, the N is above the R, the O's are above each other, and then the W is over P. You can also just remember it's Southern, Northern, Western is DNA, RNA, protein. The O's, once again, don't stand for anything. A lot of times students are like, wait, what's the O? It's like nothing, right? It's just Snowdrop doesn't mean anything, right? Snowdrop, at least those are words. And so, yeah, so those will cover the important blots that the MCAT's going to make you know about. Just as like a side note, there is another blot that I don't think the MCAT's going to test you on, but this is just one of my favorite funnest facts in biology. And so there's a blot called the Far Eastern blot, and it's actually for lipids. So it's Southern, Northern, Western, and then Far Eastern. The reason it's called Far Eastern is because it was discovered in Japan, and the scientists thought, like, you know what, instead of Eastern, let's call it the Far Eastern, because it's like we're way in the East. And so I just think that that's hilarious that there's a Southern, Northern, Western, and Far Eastern blot. And so that being said, I don't think the MCAT's ever going to test you on the Eastern blot. So this is just a fun anecdote, like funny story in biology to tell. And I think that there's actually kind of like taking a second to dive into that. There's a reason that the Far Eastern blot isn't tested, right? So many times people have diseases that are based on like, I have a mutation in my DNA, which causes messed up messenger RNA and messed up proteins. And so there's so much stuff that is disease oriented and treatment oriented that is focused on DNA, RNA, and protein. So those are the things we need to be able to study and be able to research. And so the Southern, Northern, and Western blot are really useful for that. There's not a lot of diseases where like, oh, the fats, like the lipids in my body are 17 carbons instead of 16. Like that's not a very common problem that's like disease oriented. So we don't really use the Far Eastern blot that much, but it does exist. And it's a funny story on why it's called Far Eastern. Now, that being said, I actually like talking about that is something that I like to point out to students, not just because it's a fun anecdote, but because you should be thinking about, like, when you're studying, why is this something that I would care about? Why is this something a physician would care about? Because those are the things that the MCAT is going to test you on. And so if you're studying a certain topic, and like, for example, fluids, I know we talked about cardiovascular last week. If you're studying fluids, you should be thinking like, how is this related to medicine and like fluid dynamics and like breathing? Like that's fluids because the gas is a fluid, but like cardiovascular system, blood, that's a fluid. So I want you, there's always like something I used to like force students to stop and think like, how is this applicable to the MCAT? So all of these mnemonics, you want to be thinking about how does this relate to like medicine and treatments and things like that. So that was our 9th mnemonic. I think that Snowdrop is one of those like classics that it's like, this is just so high yield that you really want to get this down. Great mnemonics are either like super high yield or something that's just super complex and like clarifying that. And so this next mnemonic is more on that second half, where this is something that I also didn't have this mnemonic when I was studying for the MCAT, and I really wish I would have. So heads up, this mnemonic is a little bit dirty, but I feel like the best mnemonics are dirty because they stick in my brain at least. And so this mnemonic is, can I keep selling sex for money, officer? So each one of those words starts with a different letter, and they tell us the substrates that we see in the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle. And so can I keep selling sex for money, officer? Tells us it's citrate, isocitrate, alpha ketoglutarate, or just ketoglutarate, succinyl-CoA, succinate, fumarate, malate, and oxaloacetate, right? So can I keep selling sex for money, officer? That's CIKSSFMO. So once again, citrate, isocitrate, alpha ketoglutarate, you kind of ignore the alpha in that because it's keep, succinyl-CoA, succinate, fumarate, malate, oxaloacetate. And you should know the order of those for test day. That's something that can be like kind of confusing because they're all weird words and there's a lot of them and it's a cycle. And so where do you start is a little bit tricky as well. But having a good mnemonic for that will make that a whole lot easier to keep in mind. And so I don't think that mnemonic is quite as high yield as Snowdrop, but this mnemonic is taking something that's really complex and still something I think you should know for the MCAT and like putting it in a way that's easy to keep straight.
Yeah. And I think we've given you guys 10, but there are so many mnemonics that you can use for the MCAT and while you're studying. And so we encourage you guys to find mnemonics that stick for you, right? That's really the whole point of mnemonics, that they'll stick. And so if there's one that's, super complicated, you're not going to remember, maybe not, right? But take those fun ones, take the silly ones, take the raunchy ones, right? And run with them. We would also, if you want to share your mnemonics with us, we would be more than happy to hear them. And sharing your favorite mnemonics is also a great way to help other students out, right? And so just go ahead, share your favorite mnemonics with us. We'll be watching very excitedly.
Yeah, especially like some of these mnemonics that we just talked about, I learned them from students. And I'm like, oh, this is so great. I want to use this more in the future. And so if you have those great mnemonics, like let us know. And maybe we can kind of spread that a little bit more and kind of, help the community overall, which is obviously what we're all here about. I do want to once again thank you guys for sticking with us for 50 episodes. We're really excited to kind of like bring these like 10 high yield, our favorite mnemonics overall. And hopefully in the future, we can bring you more stuff. And I just want to once again, thank you guys for showing up. You guys are the reason that we do this.
Happy 50th.